The morning air over Rechlin is cold enough to burn the lungs. May 19, 1943. Hans Werner Lersch stands beneath the left wing of an aircraft that shouldn't exist here, not in Germany, not wearing Luftwaffe markings, not waiting for him to climb inside and fly it into the spring sky over Brandenburg. The twin booms stretch out like the prongs of a tuning fork. The central nacelle sits low, almost predatory. Two propellers massive, counter-rotating gleam in the early light. This is a Lockheed P-38 Lightning, serial number 4-12652, captured intact 3 months ago in Tunisia, when its pilot, Second Lieutenant Robert Curtis, nursed a failing engine to an emergency landing on enemy soil. Lerche has flown 73 different aircraft types, British Spitfires, Soviet Yaks, Italian Machis. He knows how to read an airplane before he ever touches the throttle, how the weight sits on the landing gear, how the control surfaces hang in still air, how the cockpit smells of hydraulic fluid and worn leather, and the particular anxiety of the last pilot who flew it. But this machine confuses his instincts. Twin engines on a fighter. American engineering philosophy written in aluminum and rivets. A design that violates every principle the Luftwaffe has learned through 5 years of total war. His orders are simple. Evaluate this aircraft completely. Document its capabilities. Find its weaknesses. German fighter pilots are dying over the Reich every day, torn apart by American escorts they can't outmaneuver, can't outrun, can't kill. The Luftwaffe needs answers. They need to know how to beat the Lightning. Lersch climbs into the cockpit. The seat is wider than a Messerschmitt's. American pilots are larger men, fed on beef and white bread instead of black bread and ersatz coffee. 2 throttle levers instead of 1. Instruments labelled in English. Engine start procedures printed on a placard above the fuel mixture controls. He has studied the manual, translated laboriously by intelligence officers who found it in the wreckage of another Lightning shot down over France. He knows the procedures. He knows the numbers. What he doesn't know yet, what nobody in the Luftwaffe knows yet, is that this airplane is about to prove them catastrophically wrong about the nature of air combat itself. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The P-38 Lightning entered combat over Europe in November of 1942, when the 36th Fighter Squadron arrived in England flying war-weary F models transferred from training units in the United States. Those first missions were disasters. Not because of German fighters, though the Luftwaffe certainly tried, but because the Lightning was killing its own pilots through a phenomenon the Americans barely understood and couldn't explain. At high altitude, the aircraft's controls would lock solid. Pilots would push and pull with desperate strength, bracing their feet against the instrument panel, and the control column simply wouldn't move. The ailerons froze. The elevators stopped responding. The aircraft would enter shallow dives that steepened into near-vertical plunges, and the pilots, young men barely 20 years old, trained for 18 months at enormous expense, would ride their perfectly functional fighters into French farmland at 400 miles per hour. The Germans collected intelligence reports eagerly, American fighters falling from the sky without a single bullet fired, some kind of structural failure perhaps, a weakness in the tail assembly. The complex twin-boom design creates flutter or resonance. Whatever the cause, the Lightning was proving itself a death trap, and the Luftwaffe's analysts wrote confident assessments. This aircraft represents no serious threat to Reich air defense. They were making the same mistake they'd made before, the same mistake that would cost them the air war over Europe. In September of 1940, during the Battle of Britain, Germany had deployed its best twin-engine fighter, the Messerschmitt Bf 1-10 Zerstörer. The destroyer was supposed to be invincible, heavily armed with cannons and machine guns, faster than bombers, powerful enough to blow British aircraft from the sky before they could react. The concept was sound, the engineering was excellent, and then the 110s met Royal Air Force Hurricanes and Spitfires over southern England, and the Zerstörers were slaughtered. The twin-engine fighters were too heavy to dogfight, too slow to escape, too large to hide. British pilots discovered they could simply position themselves behind a Bf 1-10 and fire until it disintegrated. The vaunted destroyer required its own escorts, single-engine fighters protecting the fighters that were supposed to protect the bombers. The tactical absurdity was obvious. By November of 1940, Germany had effectively abandoned twin-engine fighter development for air superiority roles. The lesson seemed unambiguous. Fighters need to be light, agile, simple. 1 engine, 1 pilot. Maximum maneuverability. This philosophy guided every German fighter design that followed the Focke-Wulf FW-190, the improved Messerschmitt Bf 109G and K models, even the jet-powered Me-262. Single engine, or in the jet's case, engines so small and close together they might as well be one. Meanwhile, America was building the opposite. The P-38's design emerged from a 1937 Army Air Corps requirement for a high-altitude interceptor capable of reaching 20,000 feet in 6 minutes. Lockheed's chief engineer, Hall Hibbard, and his brilliant young assistant, Clarence Kelly Johnson, looked at the numbers and realized immediately that no single engine available in 1937 could deliver that performance. The solution was obvious: use 2 engines, but twin engines created problems. Put them in the fuselage, side by side, and you'd have a wide, draggy aircraft. Put them in the wings, and you'd need long propeller shafts running from the engines to the nose complex, heavy, prone to failure. Johnson's solution was radical. Put the engines in booms extending back from the wings, with the propellers directly on the engine shafts. Mount the pilot in a central nacelle between the booms. Put all the guns in the nose, where they'd fire straight ahead, with no synchronization gear needed. The design was unconventional to the point of bizarre, but it worked. The prototype XP-38 first flew on January 27, 1939, 4 years after the Bf-1-10, entering a world that had already decided twin-engine fighters were obsolete. The test flight went well enough. The cross-country speed record flight that followed went better. Los Angeles to New York in 7 hours 2 minutes, averaging 350 miles per hour. Then the pilot tried to land at Mitchell Field on Long Island, misjudged his approach, and crashed short of the runway onto a golf course. The prototype was destroyed. Newspapers ran headlines about the superfighter that couldn't manage a simple landing. But the Army Air Corps had seen enough. They ordered 13 pre-production aircraft, then 66 production P-38s, then hundreds more. By 1941, Lockheed was building Lightnings as fast as their Burbank factory could rivet them together. The aircraft that emerged from that production line was genuinely unusual by any standard. Empty weight, 12,800 pounds, twice as heavy as a Messerschmitt Bf-109. 2 Allison Pfiff 1710 engines, 12 cylinders each, liquid-cooled, producing 1,475 horsepower apiece. Counter-rotating propellers, the right engine turned clockwise, the left counterclockwise, eliminating the torque effect that made single-engine fighters veer left on takeoff. 4 50-caliber machine guns clustered in the nose, plus 1 20mm cannon. Ammunition capacity: 500 rounds per machine gun, 150 rounds for the cannon. Maximum speed: 414 miles per hour at 25,000 feet. Service ceiling: 44,000 feet, higher than any German fighter in service in 1943. Range with external drop tanks: over 2,000 miles, enough to escort bombers deep into Germany and bring them home. But the Americans struggled to teach their pilots how to fly it properly. The Lightning's size and weight demanded different techniques than single-engine fighters. You couldn't throw it around the sky like a P-40 Warhawk or a P-51 Mustang. The roll rate was modest, the long wingspan and heavy engines created inertia. In a tight turning fight, a Messerschmitt or Focke-Wulf could outturn the P-38 by simply cutting inside its wider radius. And then there was compressibility. At high speed, above 450 miles per hour in a dive, the airflow over the Lightning's wings and tail would accelerate past the speed of sound locally, even though the aircraft itself was still subsonic. This created shock waves that disrupted the airflow over the control surfaces. The elevators stopped working. The aircraft would tuck its nose down further, accelerating, diving steeper. Pilots would pull back on the control column with all their strength, and nothing would happen. Some managed to recover by deploying dive flaps, small surfaces under the wings, designed to increase drag and slow the aircraft below the critical speed. Others simply augured into the ground. The 8th Air Force, flying Lightnings from England starting in late 1942, lost aircraft to compressibility at an alarming rate. Mission reports documented the problem clearly. Aircraft entered dive during combat. Pilot unable to recover. Aircraft observed to impact ground at high speed. No battle damage, no engine failure. Just physics that the pilots couldn't overcome. German intelligence officers read these reports with satisfaction. The American twin-engine fighter was proving itself exactly as vulnerable as the Bf-1-10 had been: heavy, complex, difficult to control. The Luftwaffe had learned this lesson in 1940. Now the Americans were learning it in 1943. Except the Americans weren't giving up, they were adapting. New P-38 pilot training programs emphasized energy tactics instead of dogfighting. Don't try to turn with German fighters, you'll lose. Instead, use your speed and altitude advantage. Dive on the enemy, fire, extend away. Climb back to altitude, using your superior rate of climb. Never get slow, Never get into a turning fight. Use the aircraft's strengths, avoid its weaknesses. And the Lightning had one strength that German fighters simply couldn't match. It climbed like it was trying to leave the atmosphere. The twin engines, fed by turbo superchargers that maintained power at altitude, produced nearly 3,000 horsepower combined. The counter-rotating propellers bit into the air with perfect efficiency. At sea level, a P-38 could climb at 4,000 feet per minute. At 20,000 feet, where German fighters were gasping for air, their single engines struggling, the Lightning could still climb at 3,000 feet per minute. This was the capability that Hans-Werner Lerche was about to discover on that May morning in 1943. This was the secret that would reshape Luftwaffe fighter tactics for the rest of the war. This was the advantage that German engineers had dismissed as impossible, that German pilots had mocked as irrelevant, that German intelligence officers had failed to understand despite all their captured reports and shot-down aircraft. The Americans had built a fighter that violated every rule, and it worked precisely because it violated those rules. Lerche completes his pre-flight checks. Fuel, full internal tanks, no external drop tanks needed for a test flight. Hydraulic pressure, normal. Control surfaces, free and correct movement. Engine instruments, all readings within acceptable ranges. He's as ready as he'll ever be to fly an enemy aircraft over German soil, surrounded by anti-aircraft batteries whose gunners have orders to shoot down anything that looks American, captured or not. The control tower gives him clearance. He reaches for the throttles, both of them, and begins the engine start sequence that will lead him to a truth the Luftwaffe doesn't want to hear. The right engine catches first. The Allison V-1710 coughs, spits blue smoke from the exhaust stacks, then settles into a smooth idle. The propeller blade becomes a blur. Lerche monitors the engine, instruments, oil pressure rising, coolant temperature climbing toward normal operating range. He waits 30 seconds, ensuring everything stabilizes, then reaches for the left throttle. The left engine starts more smoothly, as if it's been waiting patiently for permission. Now both propellers are spinning, counter-rotating, perfectly synchronized but mirror images of each other. The asymmetry is disconcerting. Lerche's instincts keep expecting both engines to turn the same direction, but the engineering logic is sound. No torque effect, no tendency to yaw left or right. The thrust vectors balance perfectly. He advances both throttles slightly, feeling how the aircraft responds. The Lightning begins to roll forward, heavy but not sluggish. The tricycle landing gear, nose wheel, and two main wheels is another American innovation that German fighters lack. Messerschmitts and Focke-Wulfs sit tail down on the ground, requiring careful S-turns during taxi to see where you're going. The P-38 sits level, the pilot's view unobstructed straight ahead. Lerche can see the runway, the tree line beyond it, the May morning stretching out clear and cold. He reaches the runway threshold and performs his final checks. Flight controls, free and correct. Trim tabs, set for takeoff. Propeller pitch, full fine. Mixture, full rich. Supercharger controls, automatic mode. The Americans have automated much of the engine management that German pilots handle manually. Another philosophical difference. Another assumption about what pilots should and shouldn't have to think about during combat. Lerche keys his radio, informing the tower he's ready. The response comes back immediately, cleared for takeoff. He pushes both throttles forward smoothly, evenly, watching the manifold pressure gauges climb. 40 inches, 50 inches. The engines roar in perfect harmony. The Lightning accelerates down the runway, tracking absolutely straight, no swing to the left, no need for constant right rudder pressure. At 90 miles per hour, Lerche eases back on the control column. The nose lifts. The main wheels leave the ground. He's airborne in less than 1,000 feet. The first surprise hits him immediately. The rate of climb. Lerche has flown the Bf-109G, the latest Messerschmitt, pride of the Luftwaffe. He knows its capabilities intimately. At sea level, with maximum power, the 109 climbs at roughly 3,000 feet per minute, respectable performance, competitive with British Spitfires, adequate for intercepting American bomber formations. The P-38 climbs at 4,000 feet per minute. He watches the altimeter unwind like a broken clock. 1,000 feet, 3,000 feet, 5,000 feet. The twin Allisons are barely working, their turbo superchargers automatically maintaining manifold pressure as the air thins. In a Messerschmitt, Lerche would already be adjusting the supercharger manually, managing the throttle, carefully, feeling the climb rate begin its inevitable decay as altitude increases. Not here. The Lightning just climbs. At 10,000 feet, Lerche expects the performance to drop off. It doesn't. The rate of climb holds steady 3,800 feet per minute. The engines sound exactly the same as they did at sea level. The The controls feel exactly as responsive. The aircraft seems genuinely confused about why altitude should matter. 15,000 feet, 3,500 feet per minute climb rate. The needles on the manifold pressure gauges haven't budged. The turbo superchargers are doing their job, compressing the thin air, feeding the engines as if they're still at sea level. This is what American engineering prioritized: altitude performance, the ability to fight at heights where German fighters struggle. At 20,000 feet, Lerche levels off briefly and checks his instruments. Engine temperatures, normal. Fuel consumption, higher than a Messerschmitt, but not alarmingly so. Oil pressure, steady. Everything is functioning exactly as designed. He's been in the air for less than 6 minutes, and he's already at bomber interception altitude. A Bf-109 would take 8 to 9 minutes to reach 20,000 feet. The difference seems small, 2 or 3 minutes, but in combat, 2 minutes is an eternity. It's the difference between intercepting a bomber formation before it reaches its target or arriving too late. It's the difference between having altitude advantage over enemy escorts or fighting from below, where every disadvantage compounds. Lerche tries a simple experiment. He pushes both throttles forward to maximum continuous power, not the emergency war power setting that would damage the engines over time, just the maximum sustainable setting for combat. Then he pulls back into a steep climb, 30 degrees nose up. A Messerschmitt would stall almost immediately at this altitude and climb angle. The single engine couldn't maintain enough power. The airspeed would bleed away. The wing would lose lift. The aircraft would shudder, drop a wing, spin. The P-38 climbs at 3,200 feet per minute. Lerche holds the climb for a full minute, watching the altimeter spin past 25,000 feet, then 28,000 feet. The engines never falter. The controls stay responsive. The aircraft doesn't even seem to notice it's doing something that should be aerodynamically impossible. His training, 5 years of combat flying, 73 aircraft types evaluated, tells him this can't be real. Fighter combat is about energy management. You trade altitude for speed, speed for altitude. You climb to attack, dive to escape, maneuver to evade, but you can't just climb indefinitely. Eventually, the engine runs out of power. Eventually, the wings run out of lift. Eventually, physics catches up. Except this airplane doesn't seem to have received that message. At 30,000 feet, Lerche levels off again. The air is thin enough that his breath fogs inside his oxygen mask. The temperature outside is 40 degrees below zero. Down below, Germany looks like a map, forests and fields reduced to abstract patterns, roads like thin pencil lines. Up here, American bomber formations fly their missions, protected by fighters that can follow them anywhere. Fighters like this one. Lerche tries another test, the one that will produce the most damning evidence of all. He throttles back the right engine completely, letting it idle at minimum RPM. The aircraft yaws slightly to the right, the asymmetric thrust trying to push the nose sideways. He compensates with left rudder, trimming the aircraft to fly straight with minimal pilot input. Now he's flying on one engine, 1,475 horsepower instead of 2,950. Any single-engine fighter would barely maintain altitude on half power. Most would descend slowly, unable to stay aloft without the thrust they're designed around. Lerche advances the left throttle to maximum continuous power and pulls into a climb. The P-38 climbs at 1,500 feet per minute, on one engine, at 30,000 feet. Das ist unmöglich, Lerche mutters into his oxygen mask. This is impossible, but the altimeter doesn't care about what's possible. It just keeps rising. 31,000 feet, 32,000 feet. The single Allison engine keeps running smoothly, the turbo supercharger feeding it compressed air, the propeller biting efficiently into the thin atmosphere. The aircraft is controllable, stable, and climbing. A Messerschmitt with engine damage falls from the sky. German pilots know this intimately: one bullet through the engine block, one piece of shrapnel through the coolant system, and you have maybe 60 seconds before the engine seizes, and you're gliding back toward friendly territory, hoping you have enough altitude to make it. But if this American fighter takes a hit to one engine, it just keeps flying. Slower, yes, less maneuverable, certainly, but still capable of climbing, still capable of fighting, still capable of completing its mission and bringing its pilot home. The redundancy alone is worth 1,000 feet of altitude advantage. Lerche brings the right engine back to full power and begins a series of maneuvers, testing the Lightning's capabilities systematically. Zoom climbs accelerating in level flight, then pulling sharply upward to convert speed into altitude. The P-38 does this with brutal efficiency, rocketing from 25,000 feet to 35,000 feet in less than 30 seconds. A Messerschmitt would bleed energy, Slow down. Stall. The Lightning still has flying speed at the top of the zoom. He tries high-speed dives, pushing the aircraft past 400 miles per hour. The controls do get heavier. He can feel the compressibility effects, the Americans have reported, but they don't lock up completely. With careful technique, applying steady back pressure rather than sudden inputs, he can control the dive. And once he deploys the dive flaps, small surfaces under the wings, the aircraft slows immediately, the controls lighten, recovery is straightforward. The Americans have already solved the compressibility problem, or at least mitigated it enough that trained pilots can avoid the fatal dives that killed so many in those early months. He tries turning fights, comparing the Lightning's turn performance against his memory of Messerschmitt and Fokker-Wulf capabilities. Here, finally, he finds a weakness. The P-38's turn rate is adequate, but not exceptional. The heavy engines and long wingspan create inertia. A skilled German pilot in a 109 could definitely outturn the Lightning in a sustained horizontal fight. But then Lerche realizes the problem with this analysis. American pilots aren't fighting horizontally. They're fighting vertically. Back on the ground, Lerche's boots touch German soil with a peculiar sense of displacement. He's just spent 90 minutes flying the enemy's equipment, thinking the enemy's thoughts, understanding the enemy's advantages with a clarity that no intelligence report could ever provide. The Lightning sits behind him on the taxiway, engines ticking as they cool, propellers motionless. It looks harmless now, just metal and rivets and American paint under German markings. But Lerche knows better. He's just flown an aircraft that fundamentally changes the mathematics of air combat over Europe. The debriefing room at Rechlin smells of cigarette smoke and strong coffee. 3 officers from Fighter Command are waiting veterans of the Eastern and Western fronts, men who've watched the Luftwaffe's numerical and qualitative superiority erode month by month as American production overwhelms German industry. They need answers. They need tactics. They need some way to stop the American escorts that are increasingly dominating the skies over the Reich. Lerche sits down and begins his report. He speaks carefully, precisely, using technical language because emotion has no place in evaluation reports. But the numbers he recites are devastating. Maximum rate of climb at sea level, 4,000 feet per minute. At 20,000 feet, 3,500 feet per minute. At 30,000 feet, 2,800 feet per minute. One of the officers interrupts. That's not possible with twin engines at that weight. I have recorded the data from the aircraft's instruments, Lerche replies. The turbo superchargers maintain manifold pressure up to approximately 35,000 feet. The engines produce full power regardless of altitude within that envelope. He continues. Single-engine climb performance, 1,500 feet per minute at 30,000 feet. The aircraft remains fully controllable on one engine at all altitudes tested. Recovery to base would be feasible even with complete failure of one power plant. The officers exchange glances. This is worse than they expected. Turn performance? One asks. Inferior to the Bf 109 and FOL 190 in sustained horizontal turns, Lerche says. The Lightning cannot win a traditional dogfight against our fighters. The officers visibly relax. Here, finally, is a weakness they can exploit. But Lerche isn't finished. However, American pilots are not engaging in horizontal dogfights. They use vertical tactics exclusively. When attacked, they climb. Our fighters cannot follow. When attacking, they dive from altitude, fire, then extend away in level flight or climb. Again, our fighters cannot catch them. He pulls out his flight notes, pages covered in careful German script, diagrams showing climb angles and altitude differentials. If a P-38 and a Bf 109 meet at 25,000 feet, and both immediately enter maximum performance climbs, the Lightning will have a 3,000-foot altitude advantage within 2 minutes. At that point, the American pilot controls the engagement entirely. He can dive to attack or refuse combat. Our pilot, lower and slower, has no options. The room is silent. In vertical maneuvering, Lerche concludes, the P-38 is unbeatable with current Luftwaffe equipment. One officer finally speaks. What do you recommend? Lerche considers his answer carefully. He's a test pilot, not a tactician, but he's flown enough combat missions to understand the reality. Avoid sustained vertical engagements, attack quickly and disengage horizontally, force the Americans into turning fights if possible, but if they choose to climb, he pauses. If they choose to climb, let them go. You cannot catch them. The report he writes over the following days becomes one of the most important technical documents produced by German aviation intelligence in 1943. Copies circulate through every fighter command in the Luftwaffe from Russia to France, from Norway to Italy. Tactical bulletins are issued to frontline squadrons. Training programs are modified. Pilots are explicitly instructed. The P-38 Lightning possesses superior climb performance at all altitudes. Do not engage in vertical combat. But knowing the enemy has an advantage and countering it are two different things. American bomber formations fly at 25 to 30,000 feet, where German flak is less effective, and the cold air reduces engine strain. To intercept them, German fighters must climb to interception altitude, attack through the bomber formations, then disengage. This is vertical combat. By necessity, you cannot intercept high-altitude bombers without climbing, and now the bombers have escorts that can climb faster than the interceptors. The tactical situation is simple and brutal. German fighters climb to attack American bombers. American P-38 escorts are already above them, having climbed faster and arrived first. The German fighters become the targets. If they continue their attack, they're diving into a trap American fighters above them with altitude advantage. If they break off, they've failed their mission. The bombers continue unmolested to their targets. This is the reality that begins to unfold over Europe in the summer and fall of 1943. The Americans, meanwhile, are learning how to use their advantage. The 55th Fighter Group arrives in England in September of 1943, flying brand new P-38H models with improved turbo superchargers and better heating systems for high-altitude operations. Their commander, Colonel Frank James, is a pre-war army pilot who understands that equipment advantages mean nothing without proper tactics. James drills his pilots relentlessly on energy fighting. "You do not dogfight," he tells them repeatedly. The P-38 is not a dogfighter. It is an altitude fighter. You stay fast, you stay high, you use your climb rate. If a German gets on your tail, you do not turn with him, you go vertical, climb. He cannot follow. The group's first combat missions prove James right. On October 15, 1943, the 55th escorts B-17 bombers to Schweinfurt, a mission deep into Germany that will become infamous for the devastation inflicted on the unescorted bomber formations that fly it. But the 55th's P-38s provide escort for part of the route, and their combat reports document the new tactical reality. Captain Robert Vosler's encounter is typical. He spots a formation of Bf-109 fighters climbing to intercept the bombers. The Messerschmitts are at 22,000 feet, still climbing, their pilots scanning for threats. Vosler's flight is at 30,000 feet. They've climbed ahead of the bombers, knowing the Germans will have to come up to meet them. Vosler rolls inverted and pulls through into a nearly vertical dive, accelerating past 400 miles per hour. The Messerschmitts see him too late. He fires a burst into the lead German fighter, half a second of trigger time, perhaps 60 rounds, and sees pieces fly off the engine cowling. Black smoke streams from the stricken aircraft. Vosler doesn't wait to see if it goes down. He pulls out of the dive, already extending away at high speed. Behind him, two Messerschmitt pilots try to follow. They dive after him, building speed, closing the distance. But Vosler has anticipated this. At 400 miles per hour in level flight, he pulls back smoothly into a 45-degree climb. The P-38 climbs away as if it's being pulled by cables. The Messerschmitts try to follow. Their single Daimler-Benz engines, excellent at lower altitudes, struggle in the thin air above 20,000 feet. Their climb rate decays rapidly. Within 30 seconds, Vosler has opened a 2,000-foot vertical gap. Within a minute, he's completely out of range, climbing back to 30,000 feet, where he can position for another attack. The German pilots have no choice but to break off. They've burned fuel and altitude, chasing an aircraft they cannot catch. And now they're vulnerable themselves, separated from their formation, low on energy, exposed to other American fighters above them. This pattern repeats across dozens of engagements that fall. American P-38 pilots develop an almost casual confidence in their ability to escape. Get in trouble? Point the nose up, climb. The Germans can't follow. It's not even particularly difficult, just execute the basics, trust the aircraft's performance, let physics do the work. For German pilots, the experience is profoundly demoralizing. Major Günther Röll, a veteran fighter pilot with over 200 confirmed victories on the Eastern Front, transfers to Defense of the Reich operations in late 1943. His first encounter with P-38s shocks him. "We would climb to intercept altitude," he later recalled, "and find the Americans already above us. We'd try to climb to meet them, and they'd simply climb higher. It was as if they had unlimited altitude performance. You'd commit to an attack, and they'd escape vertically, and there was nothing you could do." The psychological impact compounds the tactical disadvantage. German fighter pilots are accustomed to being the hunters, faster, more experienced, better equipped than their opponents. Now they're becoming prey, forced to watch American fighters operate with impunity above them, diving to attack at will, climbing away from danger, controlling every engagement. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The Luftwaffe tries various countermeasures. They experiment with high-altitude interceptors modified, Bf-109 models with enlarged superchargers and reduced armament to save weight. These achieve slightly better climb rates but sacrifice firepower and maneuverability. The result is an interceptor that still can't outclimb the P-38, but also can't fight effectively when it does make contact. They try timing their attacks more carefully, waiting until the American escorts are low on fuel and forced to return to England. But the P-38's range is extraordinary. With external drop tanks, it can escort bombers over 600 miles from base, deep into German territory. The Luftwaffe's window for unescorted bomber attacks shrinks to nearly nothing. They even try using their own twin-engine fighters, Me-4-10 heavy fighters armed with rockets for bomber interception. But the Me-4-10 is even less maneuverable than the P-38, and American escort pilots gleefully shoot them down. In one particularly disastrous engagement on January 11, 1944, P-38s of the 20th Fighter Group destroyed 11 Me-410s in less than 10 minutes, suffering no losses themselves. Every countermeasure fails because the fundamental problem is unsolvable. Germany is fighting American industrial capacity and American engineering philosophy, and they're losing both battles. By early 1944, the air war over Europe had fundamentally shifted. American bombers are hitting German industrial targets with increasing frequency. Fighter escorts P-38s, P-47s, and the new P-51 Mustangs are destroying German fighters faster than they can be replaced. Luftwaffe pilot losses are becoming unsustainable. Experienced veterans are dying. Replacement pilots arrive at frontline squadrons with minimal training, just enough hours to take off and land, nowhere near enough to survive against experienced American pilots in superior aircraft. The P-38's role in this transformation is significant but often overlooked by popular history, which tends to focus on the P-51 Mustang as the dominant escort fighter. The Mustang deserves its reputation. It's an exceptional aircraft, faster than the Lightning, longer ranged, easier to build in large numbers. But the P-38 arrives first, and it proves the concept. American fighters can escort bombers all the way to target and back, climbing higher than German interceptors, fighting on their own terms. The Mustang builds on what the Lightning established. Together, they make bomber escort missions viable, and bomber escort missions are what destroys the Luftwaffe. German production facilities are bombed. Oil refineries are destroyed, creating fuel shortages that ground entire fighter wings. Factories producing aircraft and engines are reduced to rubble. By mid-1944, Germany is losing more fighters to bombing and fuel shortages than to actual combat. And through all of this, the tactical reality, discovered by Hans-Werner Lörche in May of 1943, remains unchanged. In vertical combat, the P-38 cannot be beaten by single-engine German fighters. The twin engines that German doctrine dismissed as a liability after the Battle of Britain turn out to be exactly what's needed for high-altitude escort operations. Lieutenant Robert Curtis, the pilot whose emergency landing in Tunisia delivered that first intact P-38 to German intelligence, spends the rest of the war in a prisoner camp in Germany. He doesn't know his aircraft is being test-flown at Rechlin. He doesn't know German pilots are discovering capabilities he himself barely understood. He just knows he failed to bring his fighter home, and that failure bothers him through 2 years of captivity. When Curtis is finally liberated in May of 1945 and returns to the United States, he learns what happened to his aircraft. A fellow P-38 pilot, someone who flew later missions over Germany, mentions hearing rumors that the Luftwaffe had captured a Lightning and tested it extensively. Curtis realizes it must have been his aircraft, there were so few captured intact. He never quite knows how to feel about it. Pride that his fighter proved impressive enough to warrant such attention, guilt that he delivered valuable intelligence to the enemy. In the end, he decides it doesn't matter. The Germans learned the P-38's capabilities, and it didn't save them. Knowing your enemy has an advantage isn't the same as being able to counter it. Hans-Werner Lörche survived the war as well. As Germany collapses in 1945, Rechlin is evacuated, its captured aircraft destroyed to prevent them from falling back into Allied hands. Curtis's P-38 serial number 42-12652 was burned in April of 1945, along with Spitfires, Thunderbolts, Mustangs, and Soviet fighters. The aircraft that revealed so much to German intelligence becomes ash and twisted metal. Lörche himself is captured by British forces and immediately recruited by Allied intelligence. He's too valuable to imprison his knowledge of German aircraft development. His experience flying both Allied and Axis equipment makes him an irreplaceable asset. Within months, he's working for the US Army Air Forces, evaluating captured German jets and rocket planes, providing the same meticulous technical assessments he once wrote for the Luftwaffe. The symmetry is almost poetic. German pilot evaluates American fighter for Germany, then evaluates German fighters for America. The nationality of the employer changes, but the work remains the same. Reduce aircraft to numbers, capabilities to columns in a report, combat to physics. In 1947, Lerche wrote a comprehensive report on all the captured Allied aircraft he flew during the war. The P-38 section is detailed and respectful. He notes the climb performance, the stability, the visibility, the redundancy of twin engines. He acknowledges the aircraft's weaknesses, modest roll rate, compressibility issues in early models, but emphasizes that these were manageable for properly trained pilots. His conclusion is measured but clear. The P-38 represented a significant challenge for German air defense operations from 1943 onward. Its altitude, performance and climb capability exceeded that of all standard Luftwaffe fighter types. Tactical countermeasures proved largely ineffective. Between the lines, the real message is simpler. We couldn't beat it. We knew we couldn't beat it, and knowing didn't help. The deeper irony of the P-38 story isn't just that Germany dismissed twin-engine fighters as obsolete and then faced an unbeatable twin-engine opponent. It's that Germany had all the information they needed to understand what was coming, and they still couldn't prevent it. By 1941, German intelligence had detailed reports on the P-38's development. They knew its specifications: twin engines, turbo superchargers, heavy armament. They knew the Americans were building it in large numbers. They knew it was designed specifically for high-altitude operations. They had photographs, diagrams, and performance estimates, and they dismissed it as irrelevant. The logic seemed sound at the time. Germany's fighter doctrine, forged in Spain and Poland and perfected over France and Britain, prioritized maneuverability above all else. Fighter combat was about turning inside your opponent, getting guns on target, securing the kill. Twin engines meant weight. Weight meant sluggish handling. Sluggish handling meant death. This wasn't irrational prejudice. It was a learned experience. The Bf 1-10 Zastura had proven the vulnerability of heavy twin-engine fighters. The lesson was paid for in blood, German pilots' blood, shot down over England because their aircraft couldn't dogfight with Spitfires. The conclusion seemed unambiguous. If you want to build fighters that survive, build them light and agile. But that conclusion was based on a specific type of air combat, low-altitude maneuvering fights over southern England in 1940. By 1943, the war had changed. The combat was happening at 25,000 feet, not 10,000. The mission was bomber escort, not air superiority over friendly territory. The American engineering response to these requirements, twin engines for reliability, turbo superchargers for altitude performance, size and weight for range and firepower, turned out to be correct. Germany couldn't adapt because they'd already committed to a different philosophy. By 1943, their factories were tooled for single-engine fighter production. Their pilot training emphasized dogfighting skills. Their tactical doctrine assumed maneuverability was paramount. Changing all of that would require years Germany didn't have. So they fought the air war with the doctrine they had, not the doctrine they needed. And they lost. The P-38's combat record tells the story through numbers. In the European theatre, P-38s flew approximately 130,000 combat sorties between 1942 and 1945. They claimed nearly 2,000 German aircraft destroyed in air combat. They lost approximately 1,300 aircraft to all causes: combat, accidents, mechanical failure, a kill-to-loss ratio of roughly 1.5 to 1, respectable but not dominant. But these numbers obscure the Lightning's real contribution. It made bomber escort viable before the P-51 Mustang arrived in large numbers. From November of 1942 through March of 1944, the P-38 was the only American fighter with sufficient range and altitude performance to escort bombers deep into Germany. The Mustang gets credit for winning air superiority over Europe, but the Lightning held the line until the Mustang arrived, and in that holding action, the climb rate advantage was decisive. German pilots learned to fear the P-38's ability to escape. Intelligence bulletins from early 1944 contain specific warnings. Do not pursue P-38 fighters into vertical climbs. They will outclimb all German fighter types. Attacks must be executed in horizontal maneuvers with immediate disengagement. But bomber interception isn't horizontal. You have to climb to reach the bombers. And if American escorts are above you, climbing faster, you're entering combat at a fundamental disadvantage. Some German pilots became specialists at attacking P-38s despite the warnings. Major Walter Nowotny, flying on the Eastern Front before transferring west, developed a technique: attack from directly astern, close to within 200 meters before firing, aim for the central nacelle where the pilot sits. The P-38's twin-boom design makes it difficult to spot aircraft directly behind the pilot's rear. Visibility is blocked by the booms themselves. Nowotny claimed 17 P-38s destroyed using this method, but Nowotny was exceptional: 258 confirmed victories, expert marksmanship, perfect situational awareness. His tactics worked because he was skilled enough to execute them. Average German pilots trying the same approach usually failed. Either they couldn't get close enough without being spotted, or they hit the engines instead of the pilot, and the P-38 simply flew away on one engine. The redundancy kept saving American pilots. Combat damage that would down a Messerschmitt or Focke-Wulf engine hits, coolant leaks, shrapnel through the engine block just degraded a P-38's performance. One engine shot out. Throttle it back, increase power on the good engine, head for home. Often they made it. The pilots walked away. The aircraft was repaired. Both returned to combat. Germany couldn't match this resilience. A single-engine fighter with engine damage was, at best, a glider trying to make friendly territory before the engine seized completely. At worst, it was a coffin. German pilots knew this intimately. It influenced their tactics. A damaged engine meant immediate disengagement, nursing the dying aircraft home, hoping the coolant held out long enough. American P-38 pilots could often continue fighting even after taking hits. By the spring of 1944, the Luftwaffe was in full crisis. The Americans have introduced the P-51 Mustang, which combines the P-38's range with even better performance and significantly lower cost. The British are flying long-range Spitfires. Soviet forces are advancing from the east, crushing German armies and destroying hundreds of Luftwaffe aircraft on the ground. Germany is fighting a three-front air war it cannot win. The P-38's role begins to shift. With Mustangs available for high-altitude escort, many Lightning groups transition to ground attack missions, strafing trains, destroying trucks, bombing bridges. The P-38 proves excellent at this. The twin engines provide redundancy against ground fire. The heavy nose armament 450s and a 20mm cannon can destroy almost anything on the ground. The aircraft is fast enough to survive in hostile airspace but stable enough for accurate ground attack. But some Lightning groups continue flying escort missions, and they continue demonstrating that climb rate advantage. On April 8, 1944, P-38s of the 14th Fighter Group intercept German fighters attacking B-24 bombers over Munich. The engagement report is almost casual in its description. Observed enemy fighters at 20,000 feet. We were at 28,000 feet. We dove to attack. Enemy fighters attempted to climb away. We followed easily, maintaining speed advantage. Multiple enemy aircraft destroyed. The Germans tried to use the P-38's own tactic, climb away from danger. But they were climbing against aircraft that climbed better. It didn't work. 6 German fighters were shot down in that engagement. 0 P-38s were lost. There's a particular German combat report from March of 1944 that captures the futility of fighting an enemy with superior climb performance. The pilot is Lieutenant Heinz Nock, flying a Bf 109 G6 out of Wunstorf. He's a skilled pilot, 50 victories already, experienced and careful. His mission is to intercept American bombers attacking Hanover. Nock's combat report, written immediately after landing, describes his frustration in precise detail. Sighted bomber formation at 7,000 meters, proceeding north, climbing to intercept. Reached 6,500 meters when American escort fighters appeared above us, P-38s, approximately 20 aircraft. Continued climb to engagement altitude. Americans dove to attack. I executed an evasive maneuver, attempted a counterattack. American fighters extended away at high speed, then climbed. I followed maximum power, climbing through 7,000 meters. The Americans continued climbing. I could not match their climb rate. They reached 8,000 meters while I was still at 7,500 meters. They had an altitude advantage for another attack. I disengaged, diving away to evade. Unable to reach bombers due to escort interference. Returned to base, ammunition expended, 0 rounds. No enemy aircraft was damaged, 0 rounds fired. Nock never even got within gun range of the bombers or their escorts. The Americans controlled the engagement completely through superior altitude performance. They dove when they wanted to attack. They climbed when they wanted to escape. Nock, flying a Messerschmitt, that couldn't climb fast enough, was simply a spectator. This is the reality that Hans-Werner Lörche documented in May of 1943. This is the reality that the German Fighter Command tried to counter with tactics and training and warnings. This is the reality that couldn't be overcome, because it was written into the fundamental design philosophy of the aircraft involved. You cannot outclimb an opponent with twice your engine power and turbo superchargers, maintaining that power to 35,000 feet. You cannot win a vertical fight when your single engine is gasping for air and theirs are running at full power. You cannot force a battle when the enemy can simply point his nose up and disappear into the sky above you. Germany knew all of this by mid-1943. Knowing didn't help. The final irony is that by 1944, Germany was developing aircraft that could have competed with the P-38 on more equal terms. The Ta-152A, high-altitude interceptor with a turbo-supercharged engine, pressurized cockpit, and performance that matched or exceeded the Lightning's in many parameters. The Me-262 jet fighter, which climbed faster than anything piston-powered and could catch bombers at any altitude. But these aircraft arrived too late and in too few numbers. The Ta-152 never entered mass production, only a handful of prototypes were built before the war ended. The Me-262 suffered from reliability issues, fuel shortages, and Allied bombing of the factories producing it. A few dozen jets made it into combat. They shot down some Allied aircraft. They changed nothing. By the time Germany had answers to the P-38's altitude advantage, the war was already lost. The bombers had already destroyed Germany's industrial capacity. The fuel refineries were already rubble. The experienced pilots were already dead. Having a better aircraft design on paper doesn't matter when you can't build it, can't fuel it, and have no one trained to fly it. The war was lost in those tactical engagements from 1943 and 44, where German fighters tried and failed to intercept American bombers, where P-38 escorts climbed away from danger, where the mathematics of altitude and climb rate dictated outcomes before the shooting even started. Hans-Werner Lörche understood this in May of 1943. He wrote it in his report, and the German Fighter Command read it and knew they were facing an unsolvable problem. After the war, Lörche continued working in aviation for decades. He test-flew jets, helicopters, experimental aircraft. He wrote extensively about his experiences, producing what would become valuable historical documents on German aviation development. He died in 1993 at age 76, having witnessed aviation progress from piston-engine biplanes to supersonic jets. In his later writings, he reflected occasionally on the P-38 evaluation. He noted that the Lightning was not perfect, it had weaknesses, limitations, vulnerabilities. But in the specific tactical situation of high-altitude bomber escort over Europe in 1943 and 44, those weaknesses didn't matter. The strengths, altitude performance, climb rate, twin-engine redundancy were decisive. We understood the aircraft's capabilities quite well, Lörche wrote in a 1986 memoir. Intelligence was not the problem. The problem was that understanding your opponent's advantage does not eliminate it. The P-38 could climb faster than our fighters. This was simply a fact of engineering and design philosophy. No amount of tactical cleverness could change that basic reality. It's a remarkably honest assessment from someone who had every reason to rationalize or excuse Germany's failure. But Lörche was always honest in his evaluations. That's what made him valuable as a test pilot, he reported. What the aircraft could do, not what he wished it could do. The P-38 could outclimb German fighters. It did, repeatedly. For 2 years, until the war ended and the question became irrelevant. Robert Curtis, the pilot whose captured Lightning started this entire chain of analysis, lived until 2008. He rarely talked about his war experience. When he did, he focused on the friends he lost, the missions he flew before being shot down, the strange experience of being a prisoner watching American bombers pass overhead, knowing the crews were his countrymen. He knew his aircraft had been captured and evaluated. Occasionally, someone would ask him how he felt about that, about giving the enemy valuable intelligence. His answer was always the same. They learned what the P-38 could do. So what? They couldn't build one. They couldn't copy our turbo superchargers. They couldn't match our industrial production. Intelligence only matters if you can act on it. He was right. Germany learned everything about the P-38. They documented its advantages meticulously. They adjusted their tactics as best they could. And they still lost the air war, because knowledge without capability is just data. The Americans built 15,996 P-38s between 1941 and 1945. 15,000 aircraft with twin engines, counter-rotating propellers, turbo superchargers, and the ability to climb faster than anything Germany could field in comparable numbers. That production alone, the sheer industrial capacity to build that many complex aircraft, represented a capability Germany couldn't match. Even if every Luftwaffe pilot had flown a captured Lightning, understood its advantages, and adapted their tactics accordingly, Germany still would have faced the fundamental problem. America had more aircraft, more fuel, more pilots, more industrial capacity. The P-38's technical advantages simply multiplied the existing numerical advantage, but the technical advantages were real, and they were decisive in individual engagements, in specific moments, in the lives of specific pilots who climbed away from danger because their aircraft could do what their enemies couldn't. There's a photograph from May of 1943 that survived the war. It shows Hans-Werner Lerche standing beside a P-38 Lightning at Rechlin, the aircraft gleaming in spring sunshine, German markings visible on the tail booms. Lerche is in full flight gear, leather jacket, flight pants, boots. He's looking at the camera, not smiling, just standing there beside an enemy aircraft he's about to fly into German skies. The photograph was probably taken for documentation purposes, intelligence records showing which aircraft had been evaluated, which pilots had flown them. But it captures something larger, the moment when Germany's most experienced test pilot was about to discover a truth that would change Luftwaffe tactics for the rest of the war. In a few minutes, Lerche will start the engines. He'll taxi to the runway. He'll take off and climb into the Brandenburg sky. And he'll discover that this bizarre American-designed twin engines on a fighter, twin booms, unconventional and wrong by all German doctrinal standards, actually works better than anything Germany has built. That discovery won't save the Luftwaffe. It won't stop the bombing. It won't prevent Germany's defeat. But it will force an admission that doctrine can be wrong, that conventional wisdom can be false, that the enemy might have actually designed something superior. Sometimes the weapon you dismiss becomes the weapon that defeats you, not because of some secret trick or hidden capability, but because it was designed to solve a problem you didn't think was worth solving. Germany didn't think altitude performance mattered more than maneuverability. They were wrong, and by the time they realized they were wrong, by the time Lerche wrote his report documenting exactly how wrong they were, it was too late to build an answer. The Americans had asked the right questions in 1937. How do you intercept high-altitude bombers? How do you escort friendly bombers deep into enemy territory? How do you maintain performance at 25,000 feet? The answer turned out to be twin engines with turbo superchargers. Everything else, the twin booms, the central nacelle, the tricycle landing gear, were just engineering solutions to make that core design work. And it worked. Despite the early losses to compressibility, despite the mockery from German intelligence officers who assumed twin-engine fighters were obsolete, despite violating every principle of fighter design that had been established through the 1930s and early 40s, it worked because the questions had changed, and America had designed their aircraft to answer the new questions. Germany was still answering the old ones. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.